So we're still in chapter 6, Mishnah 6, going through the 48 different things that are supposed to be how you acquire Torah. Last week we began the one that we're going to continue talking about this week, which is part of the cluster of various attitudes that a person has to adopt in order to be able to receive the Torah. And we're at the one that says, B'Kabbalas HaYisurim. That in order for a person to be able to acquire Torah, the person has to be in a position that they, how would you translate Kabbalah? To receive, to accept. Right? The acceptance of suffering. Now, it does sound strange, whichever way you look at it. It does sound like a strange suggestion that in order to acquire Torah, you have to be willing to accept suffering. Why? Last week we spoke about the concept of the story of what suffering means and accepting suffering with the same simcha that a person accepts the brachas in their lives. We touched on that briefly last week. But why? Why would suffering have to do with Torah learning? Now, of course, if you're a cynic, you'd say because you have to suffer through all of these shiurim. You've got to have, who knows, sometimes.
Excuse me, with a smile.
Exactly. I'll tell you this, I don't know if I ever told you the story, where one day, it was on a Yom Kippur evening, and a person walks out of shul. On Yom Kippur evening, Kol Nidrei night, he walks out of shul. And the security who's standing outside, the CSO, say to him, "Oh, is the rabbi finished speaking?" So he says to them, "Yes," but he just doesn't know it yet. So sometimes that's the suffering, of the shir, is that it just doesn't tend to end. I actually came across I used to be a big doodler in class, right? Some people I used to doodle a lot during class. So I recently came across one of my textbooks, one of my notebooks actually, and I saw one of the things that I had written at the time in somebody's shir. I guess it must have been a particularly boring shir because I wrote over there, that when the rabbi doesn't realize that it's time to finish the shir, kind of thing. So maybe that's the suffering. Maybe the suffering is the fact that people don't necessarily know when to stop. But I think that obviously that you've got to be a cynic for that. So what's the link over here between Yisurim, between suffering and Torah learning? Now there's a very surprising Gemara. The Gemara says that there are certain things that can only be acquired through Yisurim. That can only be acquired through suffering. There's a whole list of things. We're only going to look at two of them today, and the one just for interest, and the other because we're focused on it. So the one the Gemara says is the land of Israel. Can only acquire the land of Israel through pain, through suffering, which is interesting.
And how long
it's not
was that written?
That's written almost, almost 2,000 years ago. So how's that? That's interesting, right? That in order to acquire the land of Israel, there's a certain pain, there's a certain suffering that we expect. And the other one, it says, is the Torah. In order to acquire Torah, a person has to be willing to suffer. Now, if you have a look at some of the famous stories that were told in the Gemara, you do see the theme. You see the theme. For example, the very famous story about Hillel. How did Hillel get to the point that he became a great Torah scholar? Because he was willing to suffer. Because he went and he couldn't get into the yeshiva because there was a fee and he couldn't pay the fee. So famously he climbs up onto the roof and he tries to listen through the skylight and he gets buried in snow. So he suffers for the purpose of Torah learning, and ultimately that works out for him and he lands up becoming this great Torah scholar, the greatest person of his generation. Maybe it's also a well-known story, but perhaps lesser known, is the story of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. His father, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, his father was a very wealthy farmer, and he wanted all of his sons to go into his so-called family business and to support themselves and to be successful. And Rabbi Eliezer didn't want to do this, and he wanted to go off and to study Torah, and his father was dead against it. And it became a point of friction between them, and eventually he went to study under Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he was so destitute that he literally didn't have anything to eat. And the Gemara tells the story, how at some point Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wanted to find out how Rabbi Eliezer was living, so he sent some of the Bochrim to go check the place where he was living. He had found a spot in somebody's house, and they discovered that he was literally eating whatever he could find, which included soil. The soil had some nutrients. That's what he was eating. So there's this principle. You see multiple stories that the Gemara tells us about people who were willing to suffer in order to be able to gain Torah, in order to be able to master Torah. It's not a surprise. It shouldn't come as a surprise to us when we're familiar with many of these stories, that there's a tremendous amount of sacrifice that people make in order to be able to learn Torah. It's so-called suffering. Now, I'm not for 1 second excusing what goes on in the yeshivas, where sometimes the food is substandard. It's not your prerogative to cause the bochrim to suffer in order for them to acquire Torah. The yeshiva's responsibility is to take care of the students, to make sure that they have nice accommodation and they have good food and that they're getting proper nutrition and so forth. It's the individual's choice that they're going to suffer in order to be able to learn. You don't have to be as radical as that, by the way. You don't have to be so radical. If a person wants to study Torah, let's be honest, in order to study Torah, it doesn't work hand in hand with an extravagant lifestyle. It doesn't. Because in order to study Torah properly, a person has to be willing to suffer through late nights, to be able to learn the same thing again and again and again, have the frustration of not understanding exactly what you're learning in order to be able to master it. And I'll tell you what's interesting, is that if you had to take the whole of Torah learning, you could split it into two groups, into like two channels of Torah learning, which are represented by the Talmud Yerushalmi and the Talmud Bavli, the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmud. Because it's quite interesting. People always talk about the fact that they're learning Gemara, right? It's what you hear all the time. They're learning Gemara, they're learning Gemara, and they're learning Gemara. And then the question is, so what is this Gemara that everybody's learning? And you discover that there are actually two Gemaras. There's a Talmud Yerushalmi and there's a Talmud Bavli, a Jerusalem and a Babylonian Talmud. So, does anybody know what the significant difference is between the two? Besides the fact that they were obviously composed in different parts of the world, hence the one is called Jerusalem and the other is called Babylonian. But conceptually, what's the difference between the Talmud Bavli and Talmud Yerushalmi? Anybody know? Anybody had the opportunity to study Talmud Yerushalmi?
Were they done at the same time?
They overlapped. So the Talmud Yerushalmi was completed before the Talmud Bavli was really getting going, but the Talmud Bavli began at the time that the Talmud Yerushalmi was still being composed. So there's overlap. But okay, so if you've really been exposed in Judaism, then you've had the opportunity to learn some Gemara. Maybe there's some radical rabbi out there who did a Gemara shir, right? But then it would have been Talmud Bavli. Most people have never really encountered Talmud Yerushalmi. So what's the big difference between them? Well, the first difference is if you own a set, if your family owns a set of Talmud Bavli versus a set of Talmud Yerushalmi, you'll see that the size is different. The Talmud Bavli is bigger, many more volumes than the Talmud Yerushalmi. If you open up and you have a look inside, the Talmud Yerushalmi is much more concise. It's much more similar in style to Mishnah. Mishnah is very concise, it's very clear. Whereas the Talmud Bavli is very elaborate and it includes all of the possibilities and the arguments and the proofs and the counter-proofs, and you could take a single subject and discuss it for many, 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 many pages. So it's interesting that there's a pasuk, we just read it recently on Tisha B'Av. The pasuk says, "B'mechashakim heshivani Hashem," that Hashem placed me, or so to speak, seated me, but placed me is probably the better word, in the darkness. So the Gemara says, what is that referring to? When it says that Hashem placed us in the darkness, it's referring to the Gemara. It's referring to the Talmud Bavli. And the distinction between Talmud Yerushalmi and Talmud Bavli is that Talmud Bavli is like groping in the darkness. You don't know where you're going as you're learning a piece. You don't know where it's headed. You don't know what the outcome will be. It's going to take twists and turns and arguments and counter-arguments before you eventually settle on some kind of resolution. And then, even then, the Gemara does not tell you, this is the conclusion. This is the resolution. It leaves that for you to work out. So there's a certain discomfort when you learn Talmud Bavli. Isn't it interesting that out of the whole experience of Torah learning, what is the vast majority of what people study the vast majority of the time? Talmud Bavli, Babylonian Talmud, which is so difficult and challenging and unclear until you eventually reach a point of resolution. Why? Because of this principle. Because in order to acquire Torah, there has to be discomfort. In order to acquire Torah, there has to be a certain amount of quote-unquote pain. Now, let's plug that into history, into Jewish history. Everybody knows about the story of the giving of the Torah. It's very clear to us. We know which part of the Torah tells us about it. We know what happened at the time of the giving of the Torah. We know where it happened. We know what date it happened. And we know all the details of how it happened. That Moshe went up onto the mountain and he had a cordon off the mountain and they had to prepare themselves for 3 days. And then there was a very loud blast of a shofar and there was thunder and there was lightning and there was fire on the mountain. And they heard Hashem's voice booming out the 10 commandments all at once. And it was too overwhelming for them. And so they had to come back to Moshe and say, please, would you speak on Hashem's behalf? And then they received the Torah and they waited again for 40. We know all the details, right? My question to you is, what is the story chronologically that immediately precedes getting to Mount Sinai? Because we all know the story. So we all know the chronology is they left Egypt, they had the splitting of the sea, they got to Mount Sinai. That's what we all know, right? But there is an episode that occurs chronologically immediately before the receiving of the Torah. What is that story? Anybody know? The what?
The son of the golden calf.
The golden calf is after the giving of the Torah, right? It's after the giving of the Torah. Is the what?
Is it Refidim?
Refidim is earlier.
Before.
Okay, what is it? Mara. The story of Mara. What's the story of Mara? Such a fascinating story. First of all, it's fascinating that it happened, because obviously everything is divine providence, hashgacha pratis. The second question is, even if it did happen, it was obviously significant enough for the Torah to tell us about it. Because there may have been many other episodes that happened that the Torah doesn't record because they're not relevant to the story. So what's the story of Mara? It says that they come to a place called Mara. Obviously it gets named Mara by the Jewish people because of the particular story that happened. They could not drink water out of this place called Mara. Why not? Ki marim hein, because the waters were bitter. The waters were bitter. Now we all read the story and let's be honest. We pretty much just kind of overlook it as, okay, whatever. It's an interesting story, and it's one of the great miracles that happened as they went, that Hashem told Moshe to take a tree and effectively, cut it down and throw it into the water, and then that would convert the water from being this bitter to drinkable water. But frankly, it doesn't feature very highly on the stories of the Exodus. It really gets overlooked. And then you get the story of Refidim and Amalek and whatever the case is, and that takes the limelight. But the story of Mara, which is straight after the story of the crossing of the sea, and is very much about their journey to receive the Torah, it's a significant part of the story that never gets attention. Now, the minute I've told you this, that Mara is linked to getting the Torah, straight away you will identify what is the symbolism of the story that is linked to Torah is water. Torah is compared to water. So now there's a story of bitter water. Before you get the Torah, you have the bitter water. This is not accidental. There's obviously a link between them. So why is this such an important part of the story? That there's water which is bitter and you cannot drink the water, and then you have to somehow treat the water, and then you can drink it, and then you can go receive the Torah. What's the significance?
It's life itself.
We say life is bitter.
No. I'm saying it is bitter, but then we have the Torah.
So now you're saying the Torah is going to fix the water. That's not how the story goes. The Torah does not fix the water.
No, the people have to fix the water.
But the people don't fix the water either, right? Hashem tells Moshe to take this branch or this tree or whatever it is and put it into the water, and that's going to that's going to treat the water. We don't really see that the people are very involved in the story. So what's the message?
Maybe their outlook was bitter.
Maybe their outlook was okay. Got to purify yourself. There's the word. I'll tell you the story. You ever hear the story back in the shtetl in the old days? There was this guy who went to his friend for Shabbos. His friend lived in a different shtetl, and he went there for Shabbos, and he tasted a food. You'll excuse the story. I hope everybody can stomach a trigger warning and all that stuff, disclaimers. So he went to his friend who lived in the next door town, and he was there for Shabbos, and he tasted a food he had never tasted before at the Shabbos meal. Kishka. He never tasted this before in his life. He comes back home, and he tells his wife, I've had this incredible food at the next shtetl, and this Shabbos, when you make the cholent, I'd like you to prepare kishka. I got the recipe. So I'm not leaving you high and dry. I got the recipe. This is how you make kishka. Go ahead, please, prepare it. So she goes. Now in those days, excuse me saying this, in those days they didn't have synthetic casing for the stuffing that goes into kishka. That's why it was called kishka, because they actually used the kishka. That's what they used. They actually used the intestines of the animal as the casing for the stuffing of the kishka. Anyhow, this guy's so excited he's going to have kishka for Shabbos. It's such a big chap. And he's waiting and waiting. Shabbos morning, you know how it is on Shabbos morning, you wake up and you have that smell of cholent that just wafts through the whole house. It's this incredible smell that just tells you that it's Shabbos. There's the smell of challah on a Friday, and there's the smell of cholent on a Shabbos morning. It's just part of the whole experience. Now he gets up on Shabbos morning, the smell that is going through his house is too terrible. It is absolutely pungent. It is disgusting. He's nauseated by the smell. He can't understand what's going on. Anyhow, he puts it out of his mind. He figures he'll go to shul. Surely when he comes back, everything will be fine. Comes back from shul. It is as bad as it was. They bring out the cholent. You can't eat. Forget the kishka. You can't eat the cholent. The entire thing. It is just, you can't even touch it. So he's furious at his friend from the next shtetl. He says, obviously, what happened is he withheld one of the ingredients. You know how it is when you share recipes. And he's obviously led me down the garden path. And so he makes a trip to the next shtetl and he yells at his friend and he says, what is this? How could you give me a corrupted recipe for the kishka? This is not on. I thought we were friends. And the guy goes through it, step by step, he goes through it. These are the ingredients, it's how you make it. He says, that's exactly what I did. And it was the most horrific experience. So then the friend says, I have one question, if you don't mind me asking. Did you clean out the kishka before you stuffed it? Right? I told you there's trigger warnings in the story. So what does that tell us? There's a halacha. The halacha says that halachically, before a person davens in the morning, a person has to do ablutions. You cannot serve Hashem with a body that is not clean. It's not possible to receive Hashem's Torah with a mind that isn't clean. So that's what the Torah is identifying, that the natural state that we live in is bitter waters. Bitter waters means that the water that's in our mind, the intellect that's in our mind, the perceptions that we have, by and large, are misaligned with the Torah. We're not naturally in touch with Hashem's message in the Torah. If we were, we wouldn't have to learn the Torah. We are naturally in a space that is different to the Torah. That's why the Gemara even goes so far as to say that there's this principle, das balabatim heipech haTorah, that the conventional wisdom of the world is typically contrary to the Torah's wisdom. That's not where we're not naturally aligned with what Hashem wants. That's why we have to learn the Torah. Therefore, in order for a person to be able to learn the Torah, you first have to treat the bitter waters. And only then are you in a position that you can access what we call Mayim Chaim, the waters of real life. You might remember back in the first chapter, we spoke about the possibility of a person who doesn't teach their students properly, and the students will then go and be exiled and they will drink from the bad waters. It's the same theme that we're discussing over here. Now the problem is, the fact that we're misaligned with the Torah is not because we're bad people, it's not because we're corrupt, it's not because we have negative intentions, it's the default setting of the human being. The default setting of the human being is to be self-interested and materialistic. That's how we're created. The purpose of the Torah is to surrender self and to be completely focused on higher purpose. So you've got to, in a sense, crack the old self in order to facilitate the new self. For example, we're told that Rabbi Zera was a great Torah scholar in the time of the Gemara. And Rabbi Zera was in Babylon, or in those days it was called Babylonia, in other words, under the Roman Empire. And he was a tremendous scholar of the Talmud Bavli, of the Babylonian Talmud, made a huge contribution to the Talmud Bavli. But then he wanted to go to Israel, and he wanted to learn the methodology of the Talmud Yerushalmi. So the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Zera fasted like dozens and dozens of fasts to forget the approach of learning that was inculcated from Talmud Bavli, so that he could be open to hearing a brand new, completely different, elevated way of learning Torah, like the Talmud Yerushalmi. Now you've got to ask yourself, is fasting pleasant? It's the same theme. It's the same theme that we're discussing over here. The theme of suffering. Suffering doesn't, God forbid, mean that a person has to go through something traumatic in their life and only then can they receive the Torah. Suffering means that a person has to be willing to experience the pain of breaking old perceptions and breaking our sense of materialism in order to be able to access the Torah. That's the message over here. The message is, in order for a person to acquire the Torah, what they have to experience is a breakdown of attachment to the physical, a breakdown of attachment to materialism. As long as a person is so, close and so involved and invested in material things, they cannot really receive the Torah. The Torah is infinite, and you're chasing things which are finite, doesn't work together. That's what it's telling us over here. But Kabbalah Sayasurim, by accepting the fact that we have to go through this painful process of relinquishing the world as we know it, that is what opens the door in order to be able to receive what Hashem has to teach us. That's why before the Torah, they go through an experience of Mara. You have these multiple stories throughout the Gemara about individuals who had to go through very difficult personal experiences in order to detach themselves from the physical and thereby to accept what the Torah has to say. Maybe a great example of this would be Rabbi Akiva, where Rabbi Akiva had become so invested in materialism that he wasn't even in a position that he could read the alphabet, let alone understand the Torah. And when he went through that painful experience of believing that he could never learn, and then he had the story of watching the water dripping onto the rock, and that reminded him that it's possible to permeate even the so-called heart of stone or the brain of stone, then that's what opened his opportunity to learn Torah. But it was a painful experience because he went to sit with children who were just starting out in like grade 1, and he sat with them in order to learn Torah. There's a tremendous humility, there's a tremendous sense of being broken. Here I am, an adult, sitting with these kids. That's what opens up the doors for a person to be able to study Torah. Or more correctly, to be able to understand Hashem's Torah as opposed to our corrupted version of how we like to interpret Hashem's Torah to suit ourselves. That's really the message that it's teaching us here, the ability to be able to break. Therefore, the Gemara tells us that when a person sits learning Torah, then they're supposed to learn Ba'ema, over Yira, over Reses, over Zeya. They're supposed to sit with all of the emotions that we experienced at the foot of Mount Sinai, which was a sense of being completely overawed, a sense of it being so palpable and tangible that they actually physically trembled. And that is how you know that you're in a position that you're learning what Hashem has to say, rather than just simply, let's hear what the Torah could facilitate for my worldview today. So that's really the message of it, okay? So this is what we call the Kabbalah Sayasurim. Okay? Kabbalah Sayasurim, accepting Yasurim.
Every time they say Gemara, do they mean they're referring to the Bible?
Generally speaking, unless a person clarifies that they're referring to the Yerushalmi, they're referring to the Talmud Bavli. Now that's going to link directly into the next phrase. What's the next phrase that we have? Hamakires makoimoi. Person who recognizes their place. Hamakires makoimoi. A person who recognizes their place. Now there are two ways that we're going to have a look at this. The first, which is relatively obvious, is the person who is, you've got to know who you are. You've got to know where you stand. Unfortunately, very often people have an exaggerated sense of self. Who we believe ourselves to be. Hamakeres makoimo is to just put ourselves into context and appreciate that there were some very great sages throughout the course of our history, and we don't come anywhere close to them. I mentioned to you last week about the person who thought that they could disagree with Rashi. Hamakeres makoimo, we have to know who we are, where we belong. So what does that mean? So the Maharal tells us that hamakeres makoimo means that a person has to recognize the limitations of our own mind. Here we are, we're delving into the Torah. The Torah ultimately is Hashem's wisdom. Hashem's wisdom is absolutely infinite. The last thing that we want is to walk in over here and say, I also, I think I know, I think I understand. It's like when people use the expression, they say, either, you hear people sometimes say, I've completed a particular section of the Torah, I've completed this Gemara. Hamakeres makoimo, we need to recognize our place. We don't complete Gemaras. We've completed a cycle of us learning the Gemara. That's correct to say. We have not completed the Gemara. We haven't begun to start the Gemara. It is infinite information. It's way beyond anything that we'll understand. That's why we go, what do we do at the end of a book of the Torah? No, the end of a book of the Torah. What do we do? Chazak, chazak. What does it say? Now you need even more strength because you have to go further. That's the point. What do we do at a siyum at the end of a Gemara? What do we call the siyum? The correct word for a siyum on Gemara is hadran. Because that's the saying at the end. There's a whole paragraph that you read, hadran alach and hadran alach, daitan alach, that we're going to come back to this Gemara. That's the message. We don't say, oh, thank you very much, throw your graduation cap in the air and now you're good. We say, hadran, we're coming back. We're going to come back and learn this again. And then in the same paragraph, or the same set of prayers that we say at the end of a siyum, the end of concluding a piece of Gemara, we say, Keshem she'azartoni l'sayim masechah zeh. We say, in the same way you, Hashem, helped me to be able to finish this Gemara, Kain ta'azreini, so you should help me to be able to learn further and to be able to conclude more sections of the Gemara. It's a whole different makiras makoimo. We've got to recognize our place. We do not access Hashem's Torah unless He allows us in. And if we don't have that perspective, we can't acquire the Torah. We can acquire tremendous knowledge, and it's not the Torah. And there's a big difference between accumulating knowledge and acquiring Hashem's Torah. So that's how makiras makoimo. A person has to recognize their place and where they come from, or where they're holding. But there's another layer to this as well. First of all, before we get to the other layer, the story the Gemara tells, because Rabbi Elazar was walking and he saw a man, and the man looked extremely ugly. Have you ever heard the story? The man looked extremely ugly. So he says to him, makes a comment, whatever the comment was, basically saying, that you're, what kind of a person are you? You're such an ugly man. So the man says to him, if you have a complaint, go complain to the one who made me. It's a fascinating story. I mean, you're talking about one of the greatest sages in Jewish history. What do you honestly think? He went up to some random individual in the street and said to him, I think you're a bit misformed. It's not possible. So what's going on over here? What's the story? The story is that he, what he saw? What looks ugly? The guy, what looks ugly is that a person thinks, I'm a big deal. That's what looks ugly to a sage. Physical appearance is irrelevant. The fact that here's an individual who walks the planet thinking, I am a macha, I'm a big deal. So Rabbi Elazar says to him, you're ugly. It's disgusting. That's a disgusting way to live. In other words, he's telling him, makiras makoima, you have to know who you are, you have to recognize your place. So the fellow replies to him, go tell my creator. Rabbi Elazar says, shkoyach, that's what I wanted you to acknowledge. I wanted you to acknowledge your creator. That was the whole point of this exercise. The whole point of the exercise was to place you in the correct situation, the correct circumstances, the correct context of where you belong in this world. You think that you're a big deal. You walk outside and everybody's got to now start paying attention to you. No, hamakiras makoima, you have to recognize where and who you are. As there's an expression in Yiddish that they say, mit a wissen, wo man steht und vor wem man steht. We have to know where we stand and in front of whom we stand. That's a makiras makoimoi. Like you see often on the front of the shul, there's a sign on the lectern, the stender that the chazan davens from, da lifnei mi ato oimed. Know in front of whom you stand. That's a makiras makoimoi. To recognize our place. And that, says the Baal Shem Tov, the Baal Shem Tov says that's the meaning of this particular Mishnah. What does it mean a makiras makoimoi? You could say it as we've described until now, which means that you need to recognize your place. It's where do you belong in the system? Who are you? Not to overblow our own greatness. But there's another way to say it, and that is, makoimo is not talking about the person at all. It's talking about a saying that the Chazal told us, which is that hu makoimoi shel oilam ve'ein ha'oilam makoimoi. That Hashem is the place of the world, and the world is not His place. That's why we refer to Hashem in certain places. We refer to Hashem as Ha-Makoim, the place. What are we trying to say? So that again, Hu Mekoima Shel Olam, Hashem is the reality within which the world exists. Ve'ein ha'olam mekoimoi, the reality of the universe is not a place that, so to speak, accommodates or holds Hashem. In other words, that's a very significant shift of perspective. There's the cliche that does the round sometimes. Instead of telling God how big your problems are, tell your problems how big God is. You've heard that cliche, right? But that's derived from this Gemara. Hu mekoymoi shel olam. He is the space within which the universe exists. Ve'ein ha'olam mekoymoi. The universe is not a space, so to speak, within which he exists. What are we trying to say? Ha'makires mekoymoi. In order to be able to learn Torah, it's not just simply that I need to recognize my place in the world, which is really important. To recognize, firstly, that I don't necessarily know how to decide halachic issues. It would be a good thing for people to learn, Very often, people are throwing around their halachic weight. Why? Because I once saw something in a book. It's we have to know our place. Or people who try and advise people on things of hashkafa, of outlook. We have to know our place. Not all of us are so qualified, even though we've been to a few shurim, we've learned a few things. We have to know our place. But mekoymoi could also mean that phrase, hum mekoymoi shel olam, to have a perspective on Hashem vis-a-vis the world. Because the way that we live our lives is we think that the world is very real. And it's not difficult to believe that the world is real because, for example, if you get up and the person next to you didn't put their chair back in properly, you could hit your shin against the chair. And then you'll know that the world is real. You don't have to philosophize. And nobody sits down and has a whole debate in the Gemara whether it hurts to walk into a chair or not. That's real. So from our perspective, mekoymoi, the reality, the place that has to be taken seriously, is the place in which we live. And because we have that attitude, it affects many, many things regarding how we learn Torah. For example, you have people who say, I can't afford to learn Torah, I've got to go out and work. Or you have people who say, I can't really learn Torah, I don't have that ability to focus, I'm ADD. I can't learn Torah. Etc., right? What do? We make the world real, and then we try to say, Ha'olam mekoymoi, how can I accommodate Hashem in this world? Now that I know my reality is this and that and the other. I have these constraints, I have these challenges, I have these limitations. Now how do I fit Hashem into that world? That way a person can't really acquire Torah. Hamakir es mekoymoi, a person who recognizes their place, meaning, or mekoymoi, his place, that it's the exact opposite. Hashem is where the world exists. In other words, it exists within His energy, within His reality. It is recreated by Hashem on a daily basis. We say that in our davening. Hamachadesh betuvoi bechol yoim tamid ma'aseh bereishis. That Hashem renews every single day, tamid, consistently through the day, ma'aseh bereishis, the whole process of creation. How then is it possible that there could be anything in the world that could be an obstruction to achieving what Hashem wants? That's what Chazal are telling us. Ein ha'olam mekoymoi. The world is not an environment that can create space, that can create boundaries for how Hashem operates. Hu mekoymoi shel olam. He is the space within which the world exists. Therefore, if I have a responsibility that I have to learn Torah, then it means that if I learn Torah, it will not, God forbid, interfere with earning a living. Again, I'm not talking about somebody who doesn't work and they just learn Torah, but I do responsibility as I'm supposed to. I'm supposed to learn every single morning, every single evening. If I think that I have limited abilities and I can't really learn Torah, well, I'm a mekoymoi shel olam. He is the one who creates the boundaries and the realities of the world. Hashem can therefore change those realities. He did it for Rabbi Akiva, and for many others through the course of our history. So that is how a person comes to master, or to, it's not to master, it's not the word, to acquire Torah, is to recognize perspective that the world does not dictate the realities of Torah, Torah dictates the realities of the world.
It's a bit confusing, because Hamakir es mekoymoi is like, so you accept where you are, you accept your limitations, you accept what you can do, but it's contrary to actually Torah learning, because it always teaches us that there's always place and more to learn, and
Good.
There's more to grow, and more to improve, and never to accept yourself as just where you are and accept where you are, that you're always striving for that greatness and that perfection or whatever it is. So it's a bit like
Confusing. Okay, good. I'm glad you asked that question. It was a very good question. It does not say hamakir es limitations, it says hamakir es makoimo. A person has to recognize their place. And a person's place is not necessarily static. So the paradox of growth is both to recognize where we are and not to be bound by where we are. So what does that mean? Let's think about that for a second. So seeing as we're talking about the concept of mekoimoi, let's look at another phrase from Chazal about mekoimoi, about a person's place. What does it say? It says, Ein mekoimoi shel adam mechabdoi. A person's place does not bring them honor. Ela adam mechabed mekoimoi. Rather, it's the exact opposite. We bring honor to our place. Okay, got it? A person's place does not bring them honor. Rather, we bring honor to our place. Now, that word mechabdoi, inside it, you can hear the word kavod, which is honor. What other word can you hear in there? Kaved, which means heavy. A person's environment doesn't weigh them down. Okay? In the same way as a person's environment doesn't bring them honor, in the same way a person's environment doesn't weigh them down. We get to choose whether our environment is a place of honor or whether it's a place of obstruction. That's basically the paradox. The paradox is to recognize where we are and then to acknowledge that we don't have to remain where we are. So hamakiras makoimo, a person has to understand where they are in order to be able to learn Torah, so that Torah should be able to take them beyond where they are. Whereas the other side of the coin is the person who thinks, I am empowered, therefore they're not in touch with where they are, cannot actually grow, because with what will they grow? You need Hashem. If we don't have Hashem helping us, we cannot overcome our Yetzer Hara. So that's the paradox, and that's the very important balance that we have to have in our lives. Amakeres Makoimo means I know where I am, therefore I accept that the Torah is going to take me beyond that. Rather than to say, I am this great individual who can break through any barrier. Or to put it slightly differently, you could say this is the key difference between Torah learning and your average motivational speaker or coach who's basically trying to tell you, if you dream it, you can achieve it, and all those things. That's not what Torah says. Torah says, Amakir es mekoimoi. If you recognize who you are and you recognize your limitations, and then you access Hashem's infinite Torah, that can guide you to exceed and break free of your limitations. So I hope that's clearer, but that's really the nakuda over here. Not chas v'shalom to think, I know who I am, therefore I'm limited, nor to think, I know who I am, therefore I'm empowered. I have to know who I am and recognize those limitations so that I can open myself up to the Torah, which can take me beyond those limitations.
Although that can sometimes hold you back.
Which part can hold you back?
To hold you to know the Makomo, that's one thing. And the other thing is maybe we completely misinterpreted another thing. And Makomo is actually a reference to Hashem himself.
Okay, so that was the Baal Shem Tov's interpretation, right? Hamakras Makom, you have to recognize Hashem. But I'd build them both together, because that's the paradox. The paradox is, if I believe that the power lies with me, I don't really have power, because as much as I think I'm a great person and I have all these assets and I'm so smart and I'm so well-rounded and so connected, I don't know, whatever the particular things are that we believe about ourselves, at the end of the day, they are limited because we are finite beings. Whereas when we recognize Mekoi Moi, that Hashem is the ultimate, so to speak, space within which we operate, then I recognize that my limitations are actually irrelevant. As long as I know who I am and where I'm starting from, if I plug into Hashem, that allows me, to escape myself.
So what about, sorry. So if you're in your place, right, and you know your place, it's very grounding. It's very like, this is who I am, this is what I have to offer, right? But what about leaving that and saying, I'm great, and I'm gonna head for greatness, and I'm gonna
Good.
What is wrong with that?
Okay.
Like,
So that's an excellent question. That's why this is such a powerful piece of Pirkei Avos, right? So let me answer the question with a completely different, unrelated story. Okay? So the Lubavitcher Rebbe would tell the story, he called it the story of the lost souls. Now, when you and I think of lost souls, we think of people who don't have a connection to their Judaism. This is a different story. The story is that there was a wealthy man who used to travel regularly, and he was so wealthy that he had his own personal chauffeur, which was basically his wagon driver. And he was also a Jewish man, the wagon driver. And effectively what happened every time they traveled to a new town, they would get there often on Erev Shabbos, and it was the wagon driver's job to then find a stable for the horses and to feed them and to put the wagon somewhere secure. Whereas the wealthy man, he'd have the luxury on Friday afternoon to go to the mikveh and to buy supplies for Shabbos. He'd get to shul early so that he could read Shir Hashirim and Tehillim. And when he got there early, all the poor people in town would often get to shul early waiting for an invitation. So he'd invite everybody over for Shabbos. One Friday, they get to the town they're arriving at, and Dafka, as the wealthy man is on his way to the mikveh, there's a wagon stuck in the mud, and the poor wagon driver is looking for help. So the wealthy man goes to help him try to get the wagon out of the mud. But he has no experience. He's never done this before in his life. But he thinks he's a big hero. He's going to do a chesed. He's going to help this person. In the meantime, he doesn't help at all. In fact, he exacerbates the problem. He makes it much worse than it was. Gets covered head to toe in mud. By the time he turns around, the wagon is still stuck in the mud. It's already Shabbos. And now he can't even get to the mikveh. Forget about buying food. Meanwhile, the wagon driver he had a mazel that Shabbos. He found a stable very quickly and he got everything set up very quickly. He had extra time in his hands. So he went and he bought some food for Shabbos. And for the first time in his life, he arrived at shul early. And he's very surprised that the wealthy guy's not there. So he goes to the poor man and he says, come to me for Shabbos. Eventually, the wealthy guy staggers into shul looking like an absolute mess. And this guy's got all the poor people coming to him for Shabbos. He's never run a Shabbos meal with guests in his life. He's never been in that position. It's a disaster. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to engage the people. They don't enjoy it. It's a complete mess. So eventually, after 120 years, the two neshamas come up to Shamayim, and they're told that you've lived wonderful lives, but there's one Shabbos you have to go back and fix. And that's the Shabbos where the wealthy guy thought he was a wagon driver, and the wagon driver thought he was a wealthy guy. So Hamakiras Mekoimoi means that yes, Hashem empowers us to be able to achieve very great things and to completely break free of our limitations without becoming somebody else. Hamakiras Mekoimoi means I have to know who I am, and that's why if you go back to the first Perek, where he said Asay L'chorav, that a person is supposed to have somebody in their life who is their halachic and spiritual guide, that's to allow us the objectivity of knowing who we are, because when we try to be somebody else, even with all these wonderful intentions, and it sounds very holy and it sounds very religious or whatever, it may not be Mekoimoi, it may not be my place, and we can cause more damage than good. So that's the balance of it. I need to know my place. Where do I belong? What am I supposed to contribute? And then in my lane, then I'm supposed to go completely beyond myself with Hashem's help to be able to break free of my personal limitations. But there's no value in trying to be somebody else because that is counterproductive.
And what happens if you don't know who you are? You don't know necessarily sometimes what you're doing.
It's a good question. What happens if you don't know? I don't want to say who you are. If you don't know what your mekoimo is, like what's your place, what you're supposed to be. So there are three answers to bear in mind. The first is I go back to what the Mishnah said. I say l'chorav. We do not have the objectivity we need often to identify where our strengths and weaknesses lie, and that's the value of having somebody who's a spiritual mentor in our lives. This is different to somebody who paskins halachas for us. This is Asay L'chorav, Istalik min Asafik. Remember, there's two Asay L'choravs in the first chapter. This is the kind of person who's a spiritual guide and mentor that helps us get past all those things that are confusing for us or that leave us in doubt. And that could be, and should be, for a woman, should be a woman, right? As opposed to an halachic authority. Somebody who we look at, we go to, and they help us get that sense of self. There's two other tools that we could use. The one is that when we know that something keeps coming up in our lives as a challenge, that means Hashem is taking us down that particular path because in that challenge lies our growth. And the other is we have to, and this everybody can be honest enough, we have to identify what skills we actually have. And we might not get this perfect, but with a little bit of self-assessment, we can actually ascertain which are our skills as opposed to which are the skills we wish we had. And if we worked with our skills, Hashem will always guide us in the direction that we are supposed to go, as long as we're humble enough to accept those directions along the way.